In this video, I'm gonna walk you through 10 tips to improve your seascape photography. So by this, I mean ocean, beaches, sea stacks, and everything in between. So let's jump right in. And my first tip is to use time-lapse mode on your camera. So this is to prevent you from having to time the waves with your shutter button. So you say you see a wave coming in, you try and click it real fast, say you miss it, and then another wave comes in, you're trying to click it. Just put your camera on time-lapse mode and sit back and relax. So what I do is I find a composition, get the focus, say I want one photo every 1 second for 50 seconds, and then as those waves comes in and out, your camera's just automatically taking a photo throughout that entire 50-second session. And then you can sit back and see which ones you like. If you don't like any of them, you can just rinse and repeat the entire process. If there are ones that you do like, but there are different parts of the photos that you find appealing, then you could just combine those waves into one. So say you like the front of the image and the way the water is swirling, and that you also like the back part of the image in a different photo where there's a certain wave coming over a different rock. So you can go in Photoshop, combine those two exposures together, and then now have the best of both worlds as you have the cool waves in different sections. And the great thing about water is that it blends really easily together. The second tip I have is to use time blends. And by this, I mean take multiple photos of the same scene except at different shutter speeds. So when I was talking about in the past tip where you combine multiple water sources together to create one awesome photo, you can now do that except add shutter speed as a new variable into that. So say in your foreground, you want that nice silky water from a 1 second exposure, but in your backdrop, you want that mist spraying in the air from a wave in the distance, and you want the pelicans to be frozen in midair. So you can take those two shots at different shutter speeds and then mask them together in Photoshop using tutorials that I teach you in the editing part of this course. So use time blends at the ocean. It is one of the best places to do it. The third tip I have is for various shutter speeds. So I'm gonna give you a brief overview of what speeds work best for what types of situations. So anything above 10 seconds is going to be very abstract and surrealist, and is basically gonna paint the ocean completely frozen. It almost is going to look like a frozen lake. And what is great about this shutter speed is you could use this with little piers or logs that are sticking up or awesome rocks to get cool effects that you can take at almost any time of the day. When you're taking shots like this, you can take it in midday lighting, turn the photo to black and white, then have a nice abstract shot of some wooden piers blocking back and forth in a white abyss. So those longer exposures you can get really cool abstract stuff with if you just pick a certain subject amongst the ocean to make that long exposure happen around. Next up is 2 to 10 second exposures. And this is where you're gonna get a bit more texture within the waves. So I like to do this if you want a wave exploding, for example, and you want a little bit of a jagged edge from it, or if you want to get a little bit more movement in those waves happening, but not necessarily perfectly still, 2 to 8 is the perfect range for that. Anything from 2 seconds to a half a second is going to be applicable for most seascape photography. So this is where you're going to get those nice silky waves in the tide pools, and is what I would recommend for most photos. It's going to give you that nice variable, but it's not going to look like too much, and it's going to give your images a lot of character with that water developing through the rock formation. After that, you're gonna wanna jump into things like 1/500th of a second and plus. So this is how you're gonna get waves that are frozen in midair, or if you have exploding crests, or really any type of motion of water that you just want completely still in the air. So usually if the water's flying through the air in any sort of direction, this is when I'll use these very high shutter speeds. The fourth tip I have is to use tide charts to determine when the tide is in and out. And this will bite you in the back. There have been times that I have hiked out to a certain area and then taken photos, then on my way back, I realized the tide is much higher than I'd anticipated. So I've actually had to climb over rocks and through some pretty sketchy situations to get back to my car. So always check the tide charts. You can just Google them online. So say find a beach you like in a popular town and then just Google tide charts. And you can see when low tide is and when high tide is. And just keep in mind when that's going to happen. And this could also be applicable to certain landscapes. So for example, there's a place called Thor's Well in Oregon, which is a pretty famous place to shoot photos. It's basically this giant hole in the rocks that all this water comes in and flows down the edges and just creates this really cool effect. you can only see that if it's during high tide. So I've shown up there before during low tide, not realizing you need to be there for high tide, and I just wasn't able to get the shot I wanted. So always keep an eye on those charts. And then you could also check out swells. So swells are how big the waves are, and this will just allow you to anticipate if you're gonna have dramatic waves or if you're just gonna have a more mellow day. So a lot of surfers look for the swell to determine where the best places to surf are. The fifth tip I have is to not be afraid to get wet. So whenever I go to the ocean, I always wear sandals and I always wear swim trunks, no matter what, because I always say that I'm not gonna get in the water, but then once I get there, I always end up finding rocks that are in the water, and I always end up getting deeper. And I'd recommend wearing swim trunks because the waves will just come in and all your pants are gonna get drenched. So don't just roll up your pants, bring actual swim trunks, and it will save you so much time and energy. So don't be afraid to get wet. That's how you get a lot of the best compositions when you're out in seascapes. The sixth tip I have is to go in the winter for the most dramatic storm conditions. So if you ever see those photos online of monstrous waves hitting huge cliffs and very dramatic seas, you're going to want to go in the winter time of that place. This is when you're going to get those winter storms. There's not going to be many people on the beach because most people want to go and see a beautiful sunset on the beach. But as a photographer, if you want that real drama of the waves in the ocean, you got to go during winter. So make sure you time your shoots correctly in that manner. The seventh tip I have is to look for the water apex when shooting water at high shutter speeds. And by this, I mean, if the water is flying through the air, you're gonna wanna wait till it's at that point where it's not going any higher, but it's not going any lower. So it's just about to dip. And when it's frozen and reached its peak, that's the best time to shoot the water because it's not gonna have blur, it's not gonna be heading in a direction, and it's just gonna look the most calm and surreal. And this is applicable for blowholes, for geysers, for waves, especially when the wave is at that crest right where it's about to fall over and break. That's the perfect moment to shoot. So you want to look for that moment and take the shot then. The eighth tip I have is to use tide pools for macro and abstract shots. And I would say out of everywhere that you can get macro shots, tide pools are some of the best locations. You're gonna get all sorts of colors, you're gonna get all sorts of organic life forms, little crabs, seashells, moss. You're gonna get weird rock formations because when water mixes with the earth, it just creates really cool shapes and scenes. So really go to those tide pools and explore them, especially if you're in a place that's not as epic as you thought it was gonna be. The tide pools will always have your back in that manner. The ninth tip I have is to look out for sneaker waves. So sneaker waves are any type of wave that is just monstrous and they completely come out of nowhere. So if you're standing on the edge of the ocean and your tripod's in the sand and you're waiting for shots, just always be on the lookout on that horizon for a wave to come in because you never know when that wave's just gonna hit you and knock you over. So I almost never leave my camera just standing in one spot if there's active water coming in and out. I'll always stand next to it with my hand basically ready to grab it because there's nothing worse than a wave just completely taking out your tripod out of nowhere, or for that matter, just getting you and your camera completely drenched because we all know that seawater is not good for cameras. So just really be omniscient about what that wave is doing and be ready for anything at any moment. And speaking of seawater, the 10th tip I have is to wash your gear. So if you get any kind of seawater on your camera or lens, just wipe it down with a slightly damp rag after and then dry it. And this will prevent your camera from corroding or rusting or letting that seawater damage it in any way. Salt is just not good for metal. So this is very applicable to tripods as well. So if your tripod's in the water and it's getting splashed on with waves, once you're done, just get a hose, rinse it off, get a water bottle, use your gallon jug in your car and just rinse that whole thing off and get it clean. And this will prevent your tripod from sticking and also try and get sand out of it too, because sand can be a major pain. And if you're trying to get a good shot and you're trying to open up your tripod and it's stuck, it can be really frustrating. So just be preventative and clean that tripod right when you get out of the ocean so you don't have to deal with the ramifications of not doing it later on. So those are my 10 tips for seascape photography. Let's go ahead and jump into the next video.